Hey everyone, today we are going to talk about ordering fractions, so follow along with this video to complete your homework.
Hey there, today we are ordering fractions for standard 4.NF.2. We've been comparing fractions, and when we compare fractions, we have to have a same denominator or a common denominator. What is a common denominator? It's when two or more fractions have the same denominator. So we know our denominator is how many equal parts are in the whole, and it's the size of the parts. So we need to make sure we're cutting all of our parts into the same size before we compare. So we did this in class, but just quickly, here are some steps for ordering fractions. If you follow these steps, then you'll know exactly what to do. First, we multiply the denominators together to find a number they all have in common. So if I look at my denominators here, 6 times 3 equals 18, but 4 times something won't equal 18. But I could do 3 times 4 equals 12, and 6 times 2 equals 12. So 12 can be our common denominator. Step 2, we are going to multiply by a whole. So it says whole number here. You can cross that out. We're really just multiplying by a whole, something like 2 over 2, which is 1 whole, or 4 over 4, which is 1 whole, or 3 over 3, which is 1 whole, to create an equivalent fraction that will change the denominator to the common number. So 5/6, to get the denominator to 12, you have to multiply by 2 over 2. 1/3, to get the denominator to 12, you multiply by 4 over 4. And 3/4, to get our denominator to 12, you multiply by 3 over 3, and you have 3 separate equivalent fractions. Step 3, we're going to compare the new fractions, the equivalent fractions we just made, by writing numbers to show their order. So I can see 4/12 is my smallest, so that's labeled with a 1. 9/12 is my next biggest, so that's going to be labeled with a 2. And my biggest number is 10/12, so that's going to be labeled with a 3. Then step 4, finally, circle the old fractions, because this is what they asked us to order. So we don't want to write our new fractions in order. We want our old ones. And then you can put them in order. So it would be 1 was 1/3, 2 was 3/4, and 3 was 5/6. All right, let's go ahead and try some together. Number 1, find equivalent fractions. We know that means an equal fraction multiplied by or divided by a whole, and a common denominator, which we know is fractions that have the same denominator, and we're going to order from least to greatest, or smallest to biggest. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is try to find a common denominator. So if I look, 2 times 4 equals 8, but I can't do 6 times something equals 8, because 6 times 2 equals 12. But I could do 6 times 2 equals 12, and 4 times 3 equals 12. So I can use 12 as my common denominator. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my first fraction, 1/2, and I'm going to multiply it by something to get the denominator to 12. I know 2 times 6 equals 12, so I can multiply by a whole to make an equivalent fraction, 6 over 6. 1 times 6 equals 6, 2 times 6 equals 12. Now I'm going to do the same thing with 3/4. I have to multiply it by a whole to get to 12. I know 4 times 3 equals 12, so if I multiply by 3 over 3, 3 times 3 equals 9, and I have 9/12. Last one, 4/6. I need to multiply it by a whole to get the denominator to equal 12. I know 6 times 2 equals 12, so I have to do times 2 over 2, or 1 whole, and 4 times 2 equals 8, and I get 8/12. Now I'm going to look at my new equivalent fractions. 6 out of 12 pieces is my smallest fraction. Next is 8 out of 12 pieces, and finally is 9/12. Then I'm going to circle my original fractions, because these are the ones we need to actually write in order. And I'll find number 1, that's 1/2, put it in my answer box. Number 2 is 4/6, and number 3 is 3/4. Now, to check this, to make sure I got it right, I can compare it to decimals, because I know fractions are division. So I'm going to take my calculator, and I'm going to type in, I know 1/2 is the same as 1 divided by 2. And when I do that, I get 0.5. So I'm going to make myself like a little check space here. All right, check. And 1/2 is 0.5. Then I'm going to put a comma. And I'm going to see if the fraction 4/6 in a decimal is bigger than 5/10 or 0.5. So 4 divided by 6 is 0.66667. Oops. 4 divided by 6. I'm just going to put 0.6. And I can see I'm going from smallest, 5/10, to bigger, 6/10. Let me check 3/4. 3 divided by 4. I get 0.75. I can just put 0.7 or 7/10, and I see I'm going 5, 6, 7, smallest to biggest. So that means my fractions are in order. Okay, on the back, my directions are the same. If I need to flip to the front page and look at the steps laid out for me, I can. But I know the first thing I'm going to do is look for a common denominator. So I'm looking at 4 times 3, I know that's 12, but I can't do 8 times something gets me to 12, so that's not going to work. If I do 3 times 8, that gets me to 24. So 8 times 3, or 8 times 3 equals 24. And then I know I can do 4 times something to get me to 24, because door times chicks equals 24. So now I have a common denominator of 24, so I need to change all my denominators. Starting with my first fraction, 3/4, I need to multiply it by a whole to get a denominator of 24 and create an equivalent fraction. I know door times chicks equals 24, so to create a whole, I'm going to multiply by 6 over 6, and 3 times chicks equals 8 and 18. So my first fraction, my first equivalent fraction is 18/24. Now let's do it for 2/3. I need to multiply it by a whole to get a denominator of 24. I know 3 times skate equals 24, so I'm going to multiply it by 8 over 8, 1 whole. 2 times 8 equals 16, and I get 16/24. One more fraction to make equivalent, 7/8 times a whole equals 24. I know 8 times 3 equals 24. I am going to multiply by a whole, 3 over 3, and 7 times 3 equals 21. So I get 21/24. Now I'm going to look at my equivalent fractions and put them in order. And remember the directions say least to greatest, or smallest to biggest. Oops. Okay. So do I want 18 pieces, 16 pieces, or 21 pieces? 21 is my biggest, and I need to do least. So 16 is my smallest, 18 comes next, and 21 is last. Now I'm going to circle my original fractions, the ones they want us to put in order, and I'm going to write them in order in the box. So 1 is 2/3, 2 is 3/4, and 3 is 7/8. So I can make sure I have them in the right order. I can check with decimals. So I'm going to get my calculator, because fractions are just division. So I can do 2 divided by 3, and I get 0.666666667. I'm just going to put 0.6. Then I can check 3 divided by 4 for 3/4, and I get 0.75. I'll put 0.7. And then for 7/8, or 7 divided by 8, I get 0.8. So I can see 6/10, 7/10, 8/10, they're all in order, so that means my fractions are in order as well. Let's try number 3. First thing I need to do is look for a common denominator. Let's see, 3 times 6 is 18, and 2 times something would get me to 18, so I could do that. Or I also know 6 times 2 is 12, and 3 times something will get me to 12. I'm going to work with 12 because I think that number's a little smaller. It's just a little easier for me. But if you want to do this problem with 18, go ahead, try it with a common denominator of 18, pause the video, and then check your answer and see if you get the same thing. But I'm going to do 12 for this one. So I know 6 times 2 equals 12, and I know 3 times 4 equals 12. And that's how I'll get my common denominators. So I'm going to start with my first fraction, 2/3, multiply it by a whole to get a denominator of 12. I know 3 times door equals 12, so I'm going to multiply by my whole, 4/4. 2 times 4 equals 8, so I get the equivalent fraction, 8/12. Now let's try 5/6, multiply it by a whole to get a common denominator of 12. 6 times 2 equals 12, so I'm going to multiply by 2/2, 1 whole. 5 times 2 equals 10, and I get 10/12. And finally, 1/2, multiply by a whole to get 12. I know 2 times 6 equals 12, so I'll have to multiply by 6/6, 1 whole. 1 times 6 equals 6, and I get 6/12. All right, now I'm going to look. I have 8/12, 10/12, and 6/12. My smallest number of pieces would be 6/12, then comes 8/12, then 10/12. Circle your old fractions, the ones they want us to put in order, and write them in the box. So my first one is 1/2, second one is 2/3, third one is 5/6. And I know I can use decimals to check and see if my answer works. So fractions are just division, so 1 divided by 2, and I know 1/2 is the same as 5/10. So I'm not even going to do that in the calculator. I'm just going to write 5/10. 2/3, or 2 divided by 3, equals 0.666667, so I'll put 0.6. And then I'm going to check 5/6, or 5 divided by 6, and I get 0.833333. I'll put 0.8. And I can see my decimals are in order. 5/10, 6/10, 8/10. So I know my fractions are in order too. Okay, number 4. First thing I need to do to order these fractions is find a common denominator. So my denominators are 8, 4, and 8. I already have 2 that are the same. So it would be really easy if I could just take this one that's not the same and change it into the other. And I know 4 times 2 equals 8. So for this one, all I really need to do is change 3/4 times something to get me to a denominator of 8. And then I can just look at the other 2. So I know 4 times 2 equals 8. I'm going to multiply by 1 whole, 2/2. And 3 times 2 is 6/8. So now I have the fraction 6/8, which I changed. I'm comparing it to 5/8, and I'm comparing it to 3/8. So if I look, I can see 3/8 is the smallest, 5/8 is the next one, and 6/8 is the third one. I'm going to circle my original fractions, or my old ones. 3/4 is the only one that's different. These two stayed the same, and I'm going to put them in order. 3/8, 5/8, and 3/4. That was nice. I only had to change one. I didn't have to change them all. So now let's just do a check with our calculator to compare the decimals. And if I do 3 divided by 8 for 3/8, when I'm checking over here, I get 0.3. Then if I check 5 divided by 8 for 5/8, I get 0.6. So far, smaller to bigger. And then if I check 3/4, 3 divided by 4, I get 0.7. So 3/10 to 6/10 to 7/10, my decimals are in order, which means my fractions are in order too. All right, let's do one more, number 5. We have 1/2, 7/12, and 4/10. So I need to see, let's see, 2 times 12 I know equals 24. 10 times something won't get me to 24 because all multiples of 10 end in 0 and 24 ends in a 4. So that's not going to work. So I'm going to try 12 times 10. I know that equals 120. So I need to figure out 2 times something gets me to 120. So that's missing multiplication. I can use my calculator or just mental math to figure out 120 divided by 2 That gets me to 60. So I have to do 2 times 60 to get 120. This is a bigger denominator than I'm used to working with, but it's still all the same steps. I'm going to start by changing 1/2. I'm going to multiply it by a whole to get 120ths. I know 2 times 60 gets me 120, so I'm going to multiply by the whole 60 over 60 to get 1 times 60 equals 60, 60 120ths. Now I'm going to do it with 12. 7 12ths times a whole equals a denominator of 120. I know 12 times 10 equals 120, so I'm going to have to multiply by the whole 10 over 10. 7 times 10 equals 70. One more, 4/10 times a whole to get a denominator of 120. I know that 10 times 12 equals 120, so I'm going to multiply by the whole 12 over 12. 4 times 12 equals 48. Now I'm going to put my fractions in order. So 48 out of 120 is my smallest. Then comes 60 120ths. Then 70 120ths. Circle my original fractions. And I'm going to write them in order. Number 1 is 4/10. Number 2 is 1/2. And number 3 is 7/12. I'm going to check the decimals to make sure I didn't make any mistakes, because fraction is just division. I'm going to do 4 divided by 10 for 4/10, and that is 0.4. Then 1/2, I know that one is just 0.5. And then 7 divided by 12 for 7/12 is, oh wait, this is 0.52 if I just cut it off at 1. So I'm going to put another one here. 0.58. To compare these and see which one is bigger, I have this one goes to tenths and this goes to hundredths. So I'm going to put a 0 here to make it easier to compare. And I know that 50 hundredths is smaller than 58 hundredths. So I'm in order here because it goes 4/10 or 40 hundredths, then 50 hundredths, then 58 hundredths. So I know I'm good and my fractions are in order. All right, good job.
All right, good job ordering those fractions. I'll see you tomorrow.